The evening air was still warm as David wiped the sweat from his forehead. He had just finished his usual 3-mile run through the quiet streets of Pine Valley, a suburban neighborhood where every lawn looked perfectly trimmed and every house seemed to tell the same story of middle-class success. His running shoes made soft sounds on the sidewalk as he walked the last block home, cooling down from his workout. David loved this time of day. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. Most of his neighbors were inside having dinner or watching television. It was peaceful. After a long day working as an IT specialist at the local hospital, these evening runs were his way of clearing his mind and staying healthy. As he turned onto Maple Street, his street, David noticed his neighbor Helen standing in her driveway. She was holding her phone up to her ear, and even from a distance he could tell she was upset about something. Helen had moved into the house across the street about 6 months ago, and she had quickly made herself known in the neighborhood. She was the type of person who noticed everything and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. Helen was in her mid-50s, always dressed nicely even when she was just checking her mailbox. She had gotten herself elected to the Homeowners Association board almost immediately after moving in. Since then, she had sent several letters to neighbors about various violations. David had received one about leaving his trash cans out too, long after pickup day. Another neighbor got a letter about their fence being 2 inches too tall. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his garage door remote. He pressed the button and watched as the white door slowly rolled up, revealing his garage. Inside sat his pride and joy, a silver Honda Accord that he had saved up for months to buy. He had purchased it just 3 weeks ago from Henderson Motors downtown. It was his first brand new car, and every time he saw it, he felt a little surge of pride. The car still had that new car smell, and the metallic silver paint gleamed even in the dim light of the garage. David had always driven older, used cars before this. His previous car had been a 10-year-old sedan that seemed to need repairs every few months. When it finally died completely, he decided to treat himself to something reliable and new. As David walked toward his garage, he noticed that Helen's voice was getting louder. He couldn't make out everything she was saying, but he caught a few words here and there. She seemed to be talking about a car, something about theft. David paused for a moment, wondering if someone in the neighborhood had their car stolen. That would be unusual for Pine Valley. Crime was pretty rare here, which was one of the reasons David had chosen to buy his house in this area 2 years ago. Helen was pacing back and forth in her driveway now, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. Her voice carried across the quiet street, though David still couldn't understand most of what she was saying. He figured it wasn't really his business anyway. Helen always seemed to be involved in some kind of drama or complaint. David grabbed his water bottle from the back seat of his car and took a long drink. The run had been particularly good tonight. He had managed to beat his usual time by almost a minute. He was thinking about maybe signing up for a 5K race that was happening in the city next month. It would be his first official race, but he felt like he was in good enough shape to give it a try. As he stood there catching his breath and drinking his water, David noticed that Helen had stopped pacing. She was now standing perfectly still, staring directly at him. More specifically, she seemed to be staring at his car. There was something strange about the way she was looking at it. Her expression had changed from upset to something else, something that looked almost like anger. David felt a little uncomfortable under her stare. He wondered if maybe she was having some kind of personal crisis. People sometimes acted strange when they were dealing with difficult situations. Maybe someone in her family was sick, or she was having money problems. He considered walking over to ask if everything was okay, but something about her body language told him to keep his distance. Helen's voice suddenly got much louder. David could now hear her clearly saying things like, "Yes, that's right," and "I'm absolutely certain." She was nodding her head vigorously as she spoke into the phone. Whatever conversation she was having, it seemed to be reaching some kind of climax. David decided to head inside. He had a shower to take and dinner to prepare. Tomorrow was going to be another busy day at work. The hospital's computer system had been acting up lately. and he knew he would probably spend most of the day troubleshooting problems and updating software. He pressed the garage door remote again, expecting the door to close so he could go inside, through the connecting door to his kitchen. But just as the door started to move, Helen's voice rang out across the street, clear as a bell. "That's my car," she shouted. David stopped dead in his tracks. He turned to look at Helen, who was now pointing directly at his Honda. Her face was red, and she looked absolutely furious. She took a few steps toward the street, still pointing at his garage. "I just bought that exact car 2 days ago." Helen continued yelling. "It's missing from the dealership, and now I know why." David felt his stomach drop. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some kind of mistake. He looked at his car, then back at Helen, then at his car again. It was definitely his car. He had the papers to prove it. He had the loan documents from the bank. He had insurance papers with his name on them. Helen was still on the phone, but now she was talking even faster and louder. David caught words like police and stolen vehicle and arrest. His heart started beating faster, not from the run this time, but from a growing sense of panic. Other neighbors were starting to come outside. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door had opened her front door and was standing on her porch, trying to figure out what all the shouting was about. The young couple from the corner house had stepped out onto their lawn. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house, was peeking through his front window. David realized that this situation was about to get much bigger than just a simple misunderstanding between neighbors. Helen hung up her phone and marched straight across the street toward David's driveway. Her face was flushed red, and her hands were shaking with anger. David had never seen anyone look so furious in real life. It was like watching someone transform into a completely different person right before his eyes. "You need to step away from my car right now," Helen demanded as she got closer. She was walking fast, almost running, her designer shoes clicking loudly on the asphalt. "I don't know how you got it, but that vehicle belongs to me." David stood frozen in his driveway, still holding his water bottle. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This had to be some kind of nightmare. People didn't just accuse their neighbors of stealing cars. Not in neighborhoods like this. Not over simple misunderstandings. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake," David said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "This is my car. I bought it 3 weeks ago from Henderson Motors downtown. I have all the paperwork inside my house." Helen wasn't listening. She had stopped about 10 feet away from David, but she was still pointing at his Honda like it was evidence in a murder trial. Her finger was actually trembling as she pointed. "Don't you dare lie to me," she shouted. "I put a deposit down on that exact car 2 days ago. Same color, same model, everything. The dealership called me this morning and said it was missing from their lot, and now here it is, sitting in your garage like nothing happened." More neighbors were coming outside now. David could see people standing on their porches and looking out their windows. Some were even walking closer to get a better view of what was happening. He felt like he was in some kind of reality TV show, except this was his real life falling apart in front of everyone he lived near. Mrs. Rodriguez came down from her porch and walked toward them. She was an older lady who had always been kind to David. She sometimes brought him cookies during the holidays and always waved when she saw him working in his yard. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, looking concerned. "Helen, why are you shouting?" "This man has stolen my car," Helen announced loudly, making sure everyone within earshot could hear her. "I'm waiting for the police to arrive. I've already called 911. David felt his knees go weak. She had actually called the police. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. This was serious. Really serious. He thought about all the stories he had heard on the news about situations like this going wrong. His mouth went dry and his hands started to sweat. "Helen, that's a pretty serious accusation," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully. "Are you sure there isn't some kind of misunderstanding here? David's a good neighbor. He's lived here for 2 years. I know what I know," Helen shot back. "That's my car, and I want it back right now. Look at it. Silver Honda Accord, just like I ordered. How many coincidences do you expect me to believe? The young couple from the corner house had walked over, too. Their names were Kevin and Lisa, and they had a baby who was maybe 6 months old. Kevin was holding the baby while Lisa stood close beside him. They both looked uncomfortable, like they wished they hadn't come outside at all. Maybe we should all just calm down and wait for the police, Kevin suggested quietly. I'm sure they can sort this out. David appreciated Kevin trying to be reasonable, but the word police made his anxiety spike even higher. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that sometimes being innocent wasn't enough. Sometimes situations like this could spiral out of control no matter what the truth was. I'm going to get my paperwork, David announced, taking a step toward his front door. I can prove this car belongs to me. Don't you move, Helen yelled, stepping forward like she was going to physically block him. You're not going anywhere. Until the police get here. For all I know, you've got fake papers prepared. David stopped walking. He didn't want to make things worse by getting into a physical confrontation with Helen, but he also didn't like being told he couldn't go into his own house. This was his property. These were his neighbors. This was supposed to be his safe space, and now it felt like anything but safe. More people were gathering now. David recognized most of them from the neighborhood, but seeing them all staring at him made him feel like a zoo animal. Mr. Peterson had actually come outside, which was shocking because the old man hardly ever left his house. Even the teenagers from the house at the end of the block were standing on their lawn, probably filming everything with their phones. Look, I understand you're upset about your car. David tried again, speaking directly to Helen. But I promise you, this is not your car. I can show you the bill of sale, the loan paperwork, the insurance documents. Everything has my name on. It and dates from 3 weeks ago. Helen crossed her arms and glared at him. Anyone can fake paperwork. I watch crime shows. I know how these things work. You probably have a whole operation going, stealing cars and making fake documents. David almost laughed, but he caught himself. Nothing about this situation was funny. Helen was dead serious. She actually believed he was some kind of professional car thief. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. In the distance, David could hear sirens. They were faint but getting louder. His heart started pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Real police were coming to his house. His neighbors were going to watch him get questioned like a criminal. Some of them might even believe Helen's story. The police are coming, Helen announced triumphantly, like she had just won some kind of victory. Now we'll see who's telling the truth. Lisa, the young mother, looked uncomfortable. She whispered something to Kevin, who nodded and started walking back toward their house. David didn't blame them for wanting to leave. If he could disappear, right now he would. Mrs. Rodriguez moved closer to David. Don't worry, she said quietly. Just tell them the truth. Everything will work out. David hoped she was right, but he wasn't so sure anymore. The sirens were getting much louder now. In a few minutes, police cars would be pulling up in front of his house. Officers would get out and try to figure out what was going on. They would have to decide who to believe. Helen, who seemed absolutely certain that a crime had been committed, or David, who claimed to be innocent, but had no way to immediately prove it. The worst part was that David could see some of his neighbors looking at him differently now. There was doubt in their eyes. Questions. Maybe they were wondering if they had ever really known him at all. Maybe they were thinking about all the times they had seen him coming and going, wondering what else he might be hiding. The sirens were very close now. David could see flashing lights reflecting off the houses at the end of the street. In less than a minute, everything was going to change. His quiet evening run had turned into a public spectacle that would probably be talked about in the neighborhood for months. 2 police cars turned onto Maple Street with their red and blue lights flashing. The sirens cut off as they pulled up to the curb, but the lights kept spinning, casting colorful shadows across all the houses and faces. David had never seen police cars on his street before. Pine Valley was the kind of neighborhood where the most exciting thing that usually happened was someone forgetting to bring in their garbage cans. 4 police officers got out of the cars. 2 of them looked like they had been doing this job for a long time. The other 2 seemed younger, maybe newer to the force. One of the experienced officers, a tall woman with short brown hair, walked directly toward David. The other veteran officer, a stocky man with a gray mustache, headed straight for Helen. "Good evening," the female officer said to David. Her voice was professional but not unfriendly. "I'm Officer Martinez. We got a call about a possible vehicle theft. Can you tell me what's going on here?" David felt his mouth go dry. Even though he knew he was innocent, having a police officer ask him questions felt terrifying. He had never been in trouble with the law before. The closest he had come to dealing with police was getting a speeding ticket 5 years ago. "This is my car," David said, pointing toward his garage. "I bought it 3 weeks ago from Henderson Motors. I have all the paperwork inside my house. My neighbor thinks it's her car, but there's been some kind of mistake." Officer Martinez nodded and wrote something in a small notebook. "What's your name, sir?" "David Thompson. I live here at 1247 Maple Street. I've been living here for 2 years. Meanwhile, the other officer was talking to Helen, who was speaking very loudly and gesturing wildly with her hands. David could hear pieces of what she was saying, words like theft and positive identification and criminal activity. She sounded like she was trying to convince the officer that David was some kind of dangerous mastermind. More neighbors had come outside now. It seemed like half the street was watching the scene unfold. David recognized Mr. and Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down, the Johnson family from across the street, and several other faces he had seen around the neighborhood but didn't know by name. Some people were standing on their porches, while others had gathered in small groups on the sidewalk. The 2 younger officers were managing the crowd, asking people to step back and give everyone some space. But David could still feel all those eyes on him. He wondered what they were thinking. Did they believe he was innocent, or were they already assuming he must have done something wrong because the police were here? "Can you show me some identification and the vehicle registration?" Officer Martinez asked. "Of course," David said. "The registration is in the car and my ID is in my wallet in my pocket. Is it okay if I reach for it?" "Go ahead." Slowly. David carefully pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Then he walked toward his car to get the registration from the glove compartment. As he opened the car door, he heard Helen's voice rise even higher. "There he goes, touching the evidence," she shouted. "He's probably trying to plant something, or remove something." The officer talking to Helen held up his hand. "Ma'am, please let us handle this. We need to examine the vehicle and the paperwork before we can determine what happened here." David found the registration and insurance papers in his glove compartment and brought them back to Officer Martinez. She looked them over carefully, comparing the information to his driver's license. "These documents show that you purchased this vehicle on August 15th from Henderson Motors," she said. "Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right. 3 weeks ago. I can also show you the bill of sale and the loan paperwork from my bank if you need to see those. Everything's inside my house." Officer Martinez walked over to speak with her partner, who was still trying to calm Helen down. Helen was insisting that David must have forged the documents somehow, or that there was some kind of conspiracy between David and the car dealership. "My car was supposed to be ready for pickup yesterday," Helen was saying. "When I went to the dealership, they told me it was missing from their lot. And now here it is. This is obviously the same car." The officer with the mustache, whose name tag read Officer Walsh, looked tired. David got the impression that Officer Walsh had dealt with situations like this before, where people were absolutely certain about something that turned out to be wrong. "Ma'am, what's the make and model of the car you ordered?" Officer Walsh asked Helen. "Honda Accord silver 4-door sedan, exactly like that one." Helen pointed at David's car again. "And when did you place your order?" 2 days ago. I put down a deposit and everything. They said it would be ready for pickup the next day, but when I went there, it was gone." Officer Martinez had walked back over to David. "Sir, I'm going to need to run the vehicle identification number to confirm ownership. Can you show me where that is on your car?" David led her to the dashboard where the VIN was visible through the windshield. Officer Martinez wrote down the long string of numbers and letters, then walked back to her patrol car to use the radio. While they waited, the crowd of neighbors grew even larger. David noticed that his next-door neighbor Jake had come outside. Jake was a friendly guy who worked as a construction supervisor. He and David sometimes talked about sports when they were both working in their yards on weekends. Jake walked over to where David was standing. "Hey man, what's all this about?" he asked quietly. "Helen thinks I stole her car," David explained, trying to keep his voice low. "She ordered the same kind of car I drive, and when it wasn't ready at the dealership, she somehow decided that mine must be hers." Jake looked over at Helen, who was still talking animatedly to Officer Walsh. "That's crazy," Jake said. "You've had that car for weeks. I remember when you first got it because you were so excited about finally having a reliable vehicle." David felt a little bit better knowing that at least one of his neighbors believed him. But he was still worried about how this was going to end. Even if the police figured out that Helen was wrong, the damage to his reputation in the neighborhood might already be done. Officer Martinez came back from her car with a serious expression on her face. David's heart started racing again. What if somehow the VN came back stolen? What if there really was some kind of mix-up at the dealership? What if his life was about to get turned completely upside down? "Mr. Thompson," Officer Martinez said, "I need to ask you some more questions about when and how you purchased this vehicle." The way she said it made David's stomach drop. Something was wrong. The look on her face suggested that the VIN check hadn't gone the way he had hoped it would. David tried to stay calm, but he could feel panic starting to build in his chest. Helen had stopped talking to Officer Walsh and was now staring at David with a satisfied expression, like she had just been proven right about something. The crowd of neighbors seemed to sense that something important was happening, and everyone moved a little closer despite the officer's requests for them to keep their distance. David realized that his quiet suburban life was about to change forever, one way or another. Officer Martinez looked at her notes and then back at David. The serious expression on her face made David's heart pound even faster. He felt like he was waiting for a doctor to give him test results that could change his entire life. "Mr. Thompson, the VIN number shows that this vehicle was sold by Henderson Motors on August 15th to someone named David Thompson at this address," she said slowly. "Everything appears to be in order with your ownership of this vehicle." David felt like he could breathe again for the first time in 20 minutes. The relief was so strong that his knees actually felt weak. He had been innocent all along, but having it confirmed by the police made it official. Helen's face went from satisfied to confused to angry in the span of about 3 seconds. "That can't be right," she said loudly. "Check it again. There has to be some mistake in your computer system." Officer Walsh walked over to join Officer Martinez. "Ma'am, I just spoke with the manager at Henderson Motors," he said to Helen. "They confirmed that they sold this specific vehicle to Mr. Thompson 3 weeks ago. The car you ordered is a different vehicle entirely." "But it's the exact same car," Helen protested. "Same color, same model, everything." "Honda makes thousands of Silver Accords every year," Officer Martinez explained patiently. "It's one of the most popular cars in America. Just because 2 cars look the same doesn't mean they're the same vehicle." Officer Walsh consulted his own notes. "According to the dealership, your car is still being prepared for delivery. There was a delay with some of the optional equipment you requested. They tried calling you this morning to explain, but you had already left for the dealership." David watched as the reality of the situation slowly sank in for Helen. Her face was turning red again, but this time it seemed to be from embarrassment rather than anger. She looked around at all the neighbors who were watching, then back at the police officers, then at David. I don't understand," Helen said quietly. "They told me my car was missing. I was sure. There was a miscommunication at the dealership," Officer Walsh continued. "Your car was moved to a different part of their lot for some final preparation work. The salesperson you spoke with this morning was new and didn't know where it had been moved to. When they couldn't find it immediately, they assumed it had been stolen." The crowd of neighbors was starting to murmur among themselves. David could hear fragments of conversations, people trying to process what had just happened. Some of them looked disappointed, like they had been expecting a more dramatic conclusion to the evening's entertainment. Mrs. Rodriguez walked over to David. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this," she said quietly. "I knew there had to be some explanation." Jake patted David on the shoulder. Man, that was intense. I can't believe she actually called the cops. Helen was still standing in the middle of the street, looking lost and confused. The certainty that had driven her to make such a dramatic accusation was completely gone. She seemed to be realizing for the first time what she had actually done. Officer Martinez closed her notebook. Mr. Thompson, you're free to go. Sorry for the inconvenience. These kinds of misunderstandings happen more often than you might think. What about her? David asked, nodding toward Helen. She called the police and accused me of stealing a car. Isn't that filing a false report or something? Officer Walsh shook his head. She genuinely believed a crime had been committed. There was no malicious intent to file a false report. She was just mistaken about the facts. David wasn't sure how he felt about that explanation. Helen hadn't just made a simple mistake. She had jumped to conclusions, refused to listen to reason, and created a huge public scene that could have seriously damaged his reputation. But he also understood that pressing charges would probably just make the situation worse for everyone involved. Helen finally walked over to where David was standing. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. The confidence and anger that had driven her earlier were completely gone. I'm sorry, she said quietly, barely loud enough for David to hear. I really thought, I was so sure that it's okay, David said. Though he wasn't sure if it really was okay. The whole experience had been humiliating and scary, and he wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. I feel terrible, Helen continued. I don't know what got into me. When I saw your car and it looked exactly like the one I had ordered, I just assumed. Maybe next time you could try talking to someone before calling the police, Jake suggested. His tone wasn't mean, but it wasn't particularly friendly either. Helen nodded miserably. You're right. I should have asked questions first. I should have tried to understand what was happening before I did all this. The police officers were starting to pack up their equipment and prepare to leave. The crowd of neighbors was slowly dispersing too, people drifting back to their houses and their evening routines. The excitement was over and normal life was resuming. But David knew that things wouldn't really go back to normal. Not completely. Some of his neighbors had seen him get accused of theft. Some of them had watched him stand in his driveway while police officers questioned him about a serious crime. Even though he had been proven innocent, he wondered if some people would always have a tiny doubt in the back of their minds. Officer Martinez handed David a card with a case number on it. If you need this for any reason, like if your insurance company asks about it, this shows that you were cleared of any wrongdoing, she explained. Thank you, David said. I really appreciate how professional you all were about this. As the police cars pulled away from the curb, David looked around at his neighborhood. Most of the neighbors had gone back inside, but a few were still standing around talking in small groups. He could only imagine what they were saying to each other. Helen was walking slowly back toward her house, her shoulders slumped with shame. David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had made a genuine mistake, but it was a mistake that had caused him a lot of stress and embarrassment. Mrs. Rodriguez and Jake were the last neighbors to leave. They both said goodnight to David and told him again how sorry they were that he had to deal with such a ridiculous situation. Finally, David was alone in his driveway. His garage door was still open, and his silver Honda Accord sat there looking exactly the same as it had an hour ago. But everything else felt different. His quiet suburban street didn't feel quite as safe and peaceful as it had when he started his run that evening. David walked into his garage and hit the button to close the door. As it rolled down, he realized that this incident would probably be talked about in Pine Valley for months to come. Every time he saw Helen, they would both remember this night. Every time he talked to his neighbors, there would be an unspoken memory of the evening when police cars came to Maple Street because of a misunderstanding about a car. David stood in his kitchen, still wearing his running clothes, staring out the window at Helen's house across the street. The police cars were gone. The neighbors had all went back inside, and Maple Street looked peaceful again. But David felt like everything had changed, even though nothing looked different. His wife Rachel came home from her book club meeting just as David was finally taking a shower. When she walked into the bathroom, she immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bathtub. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David told her the whole story, while he washed his hair, about Helen accusing him of stealing her car, about the police coming to their house, about all the neighbors watching like it was some kind of entertainment. Rachel listened with her mouth hanging open. "She actually called 911?" Rachel asked, when David finished explaining. "Over a car that looked like hers?" She was completely convinced it was her car. "Even after I tried to explain that I bought it 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't listen. She thought I was lying." Rachel shook her head. "That's insane. We've both seen you driving that car for weeks. I was with you when you bought it." "I know, but Helen didn't know that. Or maybe she didn't want to know that. I think once she got an idea in her head, she couldn't let it go." After David got dressed, they sat in their living room and talked about what had happened. Rachel was angry about the whole situation. She couldn't understand how someone could jump to such serious conclusions without asking questions first. "What if you had been arrested?" Rachel asked. "What if the police had believed her instead of checking the facts? This could have ruined your life." David had been thinking the same thing. He knew that innocent people sometimes got caught up in the legal system because of misunderstandings. Even though everything had worked out okay, it easily could have gone differently. The next morning, David got up early to leave for work. He usually enjoyed his drive to the hospital, but today he felt nervous about backing out of his driveway. What if Helen was watching from her window? What if other neighbors were watching too, still thinking about what had happened the night before? When David got to work, he told his colleague Ben about the incident. Ben was shocked by the story, but he also had his own theory about what had really happened. "It sounds like she was looking for a reason to cause trouble," Ben said. "Some people are like that. They move into a neighborhood and immediately start trying to control everything and everyone around them." "Maybe," David said. "But she seemed genuinely upset about her car being missing. I think she really believed I had stolen it. That doesn't make it okay. She should have talked to you first before calling the police. That's what normal people would do." David spent most of his workday trying to focus on his job, but his mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous evening. He wondered if Helen was at work today too, or if she was at home feeling embarrassed about what she had done. When David got home that afternoon, he noticed that Helen's car wasn't in her driveway. He felt relieved that he wouldn't have to see her right away. He wasn't sure what he would say if they ran into each other, but as he was getting his mail, Mrs. Rodriguez came over from next door. She had been thinking about the incident all day, too. "I wanted to tell you again how sorry I am about last night," she said. "Helen was completely out of line. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Thanks, Mrs. Rodriguez. I appreciate you standing up for me." "You're a good neighbor, David. Everyone knows that. Don't let one person's bad judgment make you feel unwelcome here." That weekend, David was working in his yard when he saw Helen's silver Honda Accord pull into her driveway. It was indeed the same make and model as his car, but when he looked closely, he could see several differences. Her car had different wheels, a sunroof that his didn't have, and the interior was black instead of gray. Helen got out of her car and saw David watching. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the street. Then Helen slowly walked over to his yard. "I picked up my car yesterday," she said quietly. "You were right. It's completely different from yours. I don't know how I convinced myself they were the same." David set down his rake and faced her. "Sometimes when we're upset or stressed, we see things that aren't really there. That's no excuse for what I did. I embarrassed you in front of the whole neighborhood. I could have gotten you arrested for something you didn't do. I've been feeling sick about it for 2 days." Helen looked genuinely remorseful. Her face was pale, and she had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping well. "I accept your apology," David said, "but I hope you understand that this kind of thing can't happen again. Calling the police is serious business. It's not something you do just because you're confused or upset. I know. I've been thinking about resigning from the HOA board. I obviously don't have the judgment to be in that position." David was surprised by that. He had expected Helen to make excuses or try to downplay what she had done. Instead, she seemed to genuinely understand the seriousness of her mistake. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal in the neighborhood. Helen did resign from the HOA board, just like she had said she would. She kept a much lower profile, and David rarely saw her outside except when she was coming and going from work. Some of the neighbors made a point of being extra friendly to David, as if they wanted to make up for what had happened. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him cookies. Jake invited him to a barbecue. Even the young couple with the baby, Kevin and Lisa, stopped by to introduce themselves properly and apologize for not speaking up more during the incident. But David also noticed that a few neighbors seemed to avoid eye contact with him now. He wondered if they still had doubts about what had really happened that night, or if they were just embarrassed about being part of the crowd that had gathered to watch. David learned some important lessons from the experience. He realized how, quickly, a normal situation could turn dangerous when people made assumptions instead of asking questions. He also learned that even in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tensions and prejudices could bubble up when people were under stress. Most importantly, David learned that being innocent wasn't always enough to protect someone from serious consequences. If the police had been less thorough or if Helen had been more convincing, David could have found himself in real trouble through no fault of his own. Rachel suggested that they consider moving to a different neighborhood, but David decided to stay. Pine Valley was still a good place to live, and most of his neighbors were decent people. One person's poor judgment didn't have to ruin everything for everyone else. 6 months later, David saw Helen at the grocery store. They nodded politely to each other, but didn't speak. David noticed that she looked tired and stressed, and he wondered if the incident had affected her as much as it had affected him. As David drove home in his silver Honda Accord, he reflected on how one evening, Jog had changed his perspective on his neighborhood and his neighbors. He was still cautious about trusting people too quickly, but he had also seen how some neighbors had stepped up to support him when he needed it most. The incident became a story that people in Pine Valley told for years afterward. It served as a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, that communication is important, and that sometimes the things that seem most obvious are actually completely wrong.